Welcome to Module 8, Lesson 2, Percents, Fractions, and Decimals. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to convert between fractions, percents, and decimals. All right. So Lorenzo spends 35% of his budget on rent for his apartment. And we're going to write this percent as a fraction and as a decimal. All right, so our important number in this case is 35%. And we want to write this percent as a fraction and as a decimal. All right, so we want to make sure we get a fraction and a decimal. All right, so our first step is to take that percent and to write it as a fraction. Now, we know that percent means per 100. All right, so we have 35%, which means 35 per 100. However, 35 per 100, so 35 hundredths, is not in simplest form. So I know that I can divide both of these by 5 and get 7/20ths. Now, what I want to do is I want to go back to writing the percent as a decimal. So first and foremost, what I can do is I can look at 35 hundredths, and I know that converting 35 hundredths as a fraction to a decimal, well, that tells me how many place values, or what place value I need to stop at when it comes to my decimal. So in this case, I have no whole numbers, so it'll be 0. And then I also know that it's going to be 2 places after the decimal because it ends in the hundredths place. And I know it ends in the hundredths place because of the fact that my denominator is 100. So therefore, I take my 35, my last digit has to go into the hundredths place. So there's my 5, and there's my 3. So my answer would be 0 and 35 hundredths. Right, so as a decimal, it would be 0 and 35 hundredths. Now, I can also go back to my percent. I can look at 35%. And what I like to remind students of is the alphabet. So when I go from, and this is a really large font here, when I go from D to P in the alphabet, I'm going to the right. So when I go from decimal to a percent, move. Okay, so when I go from a decimal to a percent, my decimal moves right. Okay, just like my letter does in the alphabet. However, if I go from, I'll change my color here. Let's do red. If I go from P to D in the alphabet, so if I'm going the other way, I have to go to the left. So if I start at P and I work my way to D, I have to go to the left because I'm going backwards. So what that tells me is if I have a decimal, or if I have a percent and I want to change it to a decimal, I need to move my decimal 2 places to the left. And it's always 2 places. Right? So the arrow tells you which direction to move your decimal. This is just kind of a reminder thing, but what you can also write down. So again, think of the alphabet. D to P tells us to move it right. Okay, so move decimal 2 places to the right. Okay, and that's always going to be the case. That never changes when I'm going from a decimal to a percent. If I go from a percent to a decimal, I move the decimal 2 places to the left. Again, that doesn't change. That's always the same. It's always 2 places. The only thing that changes is the direction. So here I'm going from a percent to a decimal, so I know I will have to go left. All right, so I'm going to move that decimal 2 places to the left. Now I know the decimal is always at the end of the number, and I'm moving it 2 places to the left, so it'll go in front of the 35. So I would get 0 and 35 hundredths. Right, so notice that decimal was at the back, so it was behind the 5. because it was a percent, I moved it to the left to turn it into a decimal, and it turned into 0 and 35 hundredths. To double check, I can look and see, does my fraction match my percent? 35 hundredths, 35 hundredths, they match. All right, so what I would like you to do is I would like you to write each percent as a fraction and as a decimal. I would like you to write it not only as a percent, so as a fraction out of 100, but I would also like you to simplify it. So for example, for the first one, you have 15%. So yes, that would be 15 hundredths. But I also know that that can be simplified. Both of them can be divided by 5, and I would get 3 twentieths. Because when you divide them both by 5, you get 15 divided by 5 is 3, and 100 divided by 5 is 20. So not only do I get 15 hundredths, but I also could say 3 twentieths is equal to 15%. All right, go ahead and pause, and when you come back, we'll check your answers. All right, so you should have found that these were your answers. So it's always the number itself when it's a percent. It's always the number itself over 100, and then you can reduce it. And then you can always double check. So when you're checking to see if your decimal is correct, so here I moved it 2 places to the left. So 1, 2, so it would go in front of the 1. Moved it 2 places to the left, 1, 2. 2 places to the left, 1, 2. Okay, notice it's always 2 places, and because all of these are percents, it's always to the left. And again, I have 36 hundredths, and then when I read my decimal, it's 36 hundredths. So I know that they match, and so that I am on the right track. All right. Okay, so now we're going to model decimal fraction and percent equivalencies. So if I have 78 hundredths, I know that 78 hundredths as a fraction is 78 over 100. So 78 hundredths is equal to 78 hundredths. I know 78 out of 100, so 78 out of 100 is the same thing as saying 78%. So since all of these things, so 78 hundredths as a decimal is equal to 78 over 100 as a fraction, and I know that anything out of 100 is also a percent, because 78 per 100 means 78%. So then I can go ahead and I can model it, and I'm going to make my squares here. I'm going to try to make them a little bit more see-through than usual. We'll see how this works. Actually, that's not gonna, so we'll just do my boxes as normal. So I have 78%, so I know I can color in 7 rows. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I can color in all 7 of these rows. And that all should have been colored in red. Try that again. There we go. And then my next row, so it's 78, so my next row should only have 8 colored in. So just like when I have decimals, I would color in 78. So for 78 hundredths, I would color in 78 out of 100. And when I have 78 out of 100 for a fraction, I color in 78 out of 100. And again, we always say percent means per 100. So when it's 78%, I'm coloring in 78 out of 100. But now let's take a look at 1 and 42 hundredths. Okay, but now it's going to be a little bit different because we have this 1 in front, and this 1 in front does make things a little bit different because that 1 tells me that I have one full group. So that 1 tells me that not only do I have 100, because one full group means I have one full grid of 100. So I would have to color in all of these, okay, because I have one full grid of 100. Let's see if I can, there we go. So I colored in all of them, right? So I have 100, but I also have 42 hundredths because one whole So just in case we're confused here, that 1 whole is equal to, so that 1 whole is equal to 100 out of 100. Okay, because when we're talking about percents, everything is out of 100. So if I have 1 in front of the decimal, that means I have one full group of 100. So I have 100, but then I also have 42 hundredths after the decimal, which means I have another 42. So since I have another 42, I have to color in 10, 20, 30, 40, and then another 2. And then try to line this up here a little bit better. There we go. 1, 2. So because I have that 1 in front, I had to color in one whole grid. So if I add these together, that tells me I have 142 per 100, which I know since this is an improper fraction, I have to turn it into a mixed number, which is 1 and 42 hundredths. So 1 and 42 hundredths is, as a percentage, would be 100% because of the 1 in front, plus 42% because, okay, so this is 100%. And let me get my arrow here. There we go. So 100 out of 100 is 100%. 42 out of 100 is 42%. So then I'd have 142 out of 100, which is 142%. And this is possible. Think about if you have extra credit on a test, sometimes you get 103%. Well, that means that you got the entire test correct plus another 3%. So let's say that test was out of 100. You got 100 questions right plus another 3 questions that were extra credit. So you got 103%. You got more than 100. All right, so let's take a look at C. If you want to try C by yourself, go ahead and then come back and check your work. Otherwise, you can continue to work through it with me. Okay, so we're going to model it by shading. And once again, I have 125%, which means I have to have a full 100. But now I have to have 25%. So I have 10, 20, and then I have another 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so in looking at this model now, I have 100 here and 25 here. So the model shows that 100% plus 25% gives me 125%. When I change that to a decimal, I know that my decimal starts at the end and I move it 2 places to the left. And it's only 2 places, which makes sense because I should have the 1 in front because I have one whole group right here. So as a decimal, this would be 1 and 25 hundredths. Because once again, I have 100 out of 100 in the first block. I have 25 out of 100 in the second, which gives me 125 out of 100. Which is the same thing as saying 1 and 25 hundredths. So if I wrote that as a decimal, again, it would be 1 and 25 hundredths. Now, if I simplify that fraction, I can divide 25 and 100 both by 25, and I get 1 and 1/4. All right, so what decimal, fraction, and percent equivalencies are shown in each model, and then I would need to explain. So here, I see I have a full row of 10 and then 3. So my fraction would be 13 out of 100. As a decimal, it's 0 and 13 hundredths. And as a percent, it's 13%. How do I know this? I know this because 13 parts out of the 100 are shaded. On my next one, I have 1 3/10. Now, I'm actually going to write this as 1 30/100, which is the same thing as saying 1 3/10. Okay, because here I have, again, one whole group. Since I have this one whole group right here, it has to go in front of the decimal because I have one full group of 100. And then I have 30 shaded in here. So I have 30, but it's only 30 out of 100. So it's not a full group. So that's the 30/100. I can take off the 0 because I know that 30/100 and 3/10 are equivalent. Okay, again, 1 30/100 as a fraction is equal to 1 3/10 as a fraction. And then as a percent, this would be 130%. Because again, if I move my decimal, because I'm at a decimal, so I'm changing it to a percent, I would move it 2 places to the right, and I would get 130%. How do I know this for sure? I know this because one whole grid is shaded, and 30 out of 100 are shaded in the second grid. All right, so I have 96 out of 200 animals that are being treated by a veterinarian, and, or I'm sorry, 96 out of 200 animals that are treated by a veterinarian are horses. We're going to write 96/200 as a decimal and as a percent. So the first thing I have to do, because I want to write it as a percent, I have to find it with a denominator of 100. Okay? I know that I can get this to 100 because 200 is divisible by 2 to get to 100. So 200 can be easily divided to get to 100. Okay, and I'm dividing it by 2, and I can divide the top then by 2. So what I did to the bottom, I can do to the top. So I have 200 divided by 2, and then I have 96 divided by 2. So that tells me that 48 out of 100 of the animals would be horses. So now, as a fraction, 48/100, I can change that to a decimal and write it as 0 48/100. Again, it has to end in the hundredth spot because it has 100 as the denominator. Now, when I'm writing it as a percent, when I write it as a percent, I need to move the decimal. I'm going from a decimal to a percent, so the decimal needs to move 2 places to the right. And when I do that, it turns into 48%. Right? Well, now what happens if I have 1/8 of the animals treated by the veterinarian are dogs, and I want to write that as a decimal and a percent? Notice that 8 is not a factor or a multiple of 100. So when you have something that's not a factor or a multiple of 100, we have to use long division. All right, so we have to use long division to divide the numerator by the denominator. This is just like when we changed fractions to decimals. Okay, so that first step is going to be to put it into long division. And remember, it's like that fraction tips over. So it tips over and the numerator falls on the inside and the denominator stays on the outside. Okay, and I know that 8 can go into 1 0 times. And since it goes in 0 times, I know that I have to add a decimal in order to continue dividing. So if I add a decimal here, I have to add a decimal here. And then to continue dividing, I have to add a 0. Right? And I'm actually going to add this in red and make it a little bit larger so it looks like it actually goes with the numbers here. And make it red because I added it. Okay, so I have 1, and now I added a 0. How many times can 8 go into 10? Okay, because now the number is 10. Well, since the number is 10, I know that 8 can go into 10 one time. So I put my 1 up here. 8 times 1 is 8. So I put 8 and I subtract. I know 10 minus 8 gives me 2. Okay, and I know that I can't stop there, so now I have to continue with my adding of the zeros and bringing them down. So now I have to add another 0, and then I have to bring it down. That's a really big pen. Make it black and bring it down. So now I have 20. Well, how many times can 8 go into 20? Well, 8 can go into 20 2 times, because 2 groups of 8, or 2 times 8, gives us 16. And then I subtract, and I'm left with 4. Well, now I know that I'm still not done because I have a remainder, so I have to keep going. So I add another 0. After I add that 0, I bring it down, and now I have 40. Well, I know 8 goes into 40 5 times, and 8 times 5 is 40. And when I subtract, I'm left with 0. Thank goodness, because I was running out of space. So I know that as a decimal, 1/8, so 1/8 is equal to 0 and 125 thousandths. Now I want to change that decimal to a percent. So that 125 thousandths, I have to take that decimal, which is right here between the 0 and the 1, and I have to move it 2 places to the right. Once I move it 2 places to the right, I see that it is between the 2 and the 5, and that's okay. That means that I'm going to have a decimal in my percent. So that tells me that 0 and 125 thousandths would be equal to 12 and 5/10%. Which what that means then is 1/8 is equal to 0 and 125 thousandths, which is the same thing as saying 12.5%. All right, so what I'd like you to do next is I'd like you to write each as a fraction, or write each fraction as a decimal and as a percent, and when you come back, we'll check your answers. So here you should have noticed that you could multiply both of these by 4 to get your answer. So I will add in, so I have 9/25. And if I multiply both of those by 4, I get that denominator of 100 that I'm looking for, so I can change it to a percent, and I get a numerator of 100. In doing that, I know that it's 0 and 36 hundredths, and in doing that, I know that that is equal to 36%. Here, I know that I would have to do my long division. So again, 7 would fall on the inside, and 8 would stay on the outside. 8 goes into 7 0 times, add a decimal, and add a 0. 8 goes into 70 8 times, minus 64, because 8 times 8 is 64. I'm left with 6. Add another 0 and bring it down. It gives me 60. So 8 goes into 60, and I know that goes in 7 times, because 8 times 7 is 56. My number can be smaller, it can never be bigger. And I get to 40, or I get to 4, which then I know when I add that 0 will give me 40. And I know 8 times 5 gives me 40. So now I know that as a decimal, it's 875 thousandths. If I move that decimal 2 places to the right, that decimal goes between the 7 and the 5, and I get 87.5%. All right, what I would like you to do is I would like you to try these couple problems on your own. Again, these are not going to be online because of the fact that we have to color them in and there's so many different answers for one. What I would like you to do is if you have any questions, please be sure to write them down or email me so we can go over them in class.